5 minutes, really rich. They're going to be talking about in the garden when Eve was deceived, and then Adam as well. They made the decision to eat from the tree they were not to eat of. And it's an allusion that's in the New Testament in a couple of places. In particular, 1 Timothy chapter 2 is where Tim's going to spend some time. And then next week, we actually turn the page to the next unit of this study. And it's the Eden story part 3, where we get into Genesis 3, the fall. So next week, we'll begin the fall. But this is kind of wrapping up the first 2 chapters. And it's a good question. When Paul talks about Eve and what took place and how she was deceived, and the order of creation, man was created first and then Eve, but yet man was born of woman. So how important woman is. Unfortunately, due to the fall, there's been this tension between the sexes at times. Who's better? And that's absolutely the wrong question. It's not about who's better. Both are wonderful. Both are created in the image of God. Yes, there are unique roles and abilities, obviously. But what our society and culture has done to that has been very ugly and tragic. And we're still paying the consequences of that today. So Tim is trying to show us what God's intent was in the created order. And there's a couple of things that really jumped out to me. I won't share it with you now. I'll see if you pick up on it as well. But I guess all I'll say is that when he talks about knowledge and the importance of knowledge, that Adam was responsible for making sure his wife knew God's commands. Because Eve wasn't there when God gave him the command about what tree to eat from and not to eat from. So she is just speaking what she knew when the serpent tempted her, and it was not complete. It wasn't accurate what she said. So she didn't get the whole story, did she? So who's at fault for that? Adam. Adam should have stepped up to the plate and made sure. And likewise, when you get over into the New Testament, when Paul addresses false teaching, heresies that were going on in Ephesus, where Timothy is at. When Paul writes to Timothy, it's in Ephesus. You had all these myths and genealogies that were going around, and even ideas women had about how they were better than men. There was some of that was going on as well, and that was creeping in, and it was because the elders, the apostles, they were not instructing the church like they should have. So it gets back to a knowledge. What do we know? What do we understand to be true? And if you don't understand truth, if you don't have the complete picture, you're gonna pass on, right? False information, and thus it's gonna cause us to act improperly. So anyway, I think you're gonna be stretched in a good way, encouraged, and hopefully some good conversation after this lesson. So I'll go back and start it up, and we'll talk afterwards.
Okay. Yes.
So what's your take on this quote, correct me if I'm wrong, but what's your take on this not necessarily being about a theology of gender? What's your take on Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 when he brings up Genesis 2? I forget what he's arguing necessarily, but what's your take on that?
Yep. Yeah. So the creation order is the detail that Paul draws upon. It's in 2 Timothy. It's a rabbit hole, but
he's talking about 2 Corinthians 11:10 with the head coverings. But then he goes on to say that man comes from woman and they're both coming.
Paul said it somewhere.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
No, he brings up creation order in this narrative 2 times. That's right. Yeah. One's in 1 Corinthians 11, where there's some issue about how women's hair is being displayed and how men's heads are being displayed. It's actually a problem with both women and men. Surprise, surprise, it's the issue with the women that has somehow come into the spotlight of the, anyway. It's a whole other matter. So it's a problem with men and women, and he turns to the Genesis narratives. But there, he notes a reciprocal relationship, that in the narrative, it's a man halved and then a man and a woman. But then he immediately says, but listen, man comes from woman in the narratives to follow. And he sees there a reciprocity and a rabbit hole. In fact, there will be, or for some of you watching online, there is a class on 1 Corinthians that'll be a part of the library of the Bible Project classroom where that will get unpacked in more detail. The one that seems more clear is in Paul's letter to Timothy. Anybody? We may as well. We're on the topic. Okay. So it's a deep rabbit hole. We don't have time to go fully down it. But in Paul's letter to Timothy, in the opening, actually I won't go to chapter 2. You have to go to chapter 1. Paul writes a letter to Timothy, who's a pastor in Ephesus, and right out of the gate, he says, listen, I'm putting out a fire right now. This whole letter is to help you put out a fire. There's people teaching strange theology that does not draw attention to Jesus. Rather, it's getting into these mythos, myths, and speculation about genealogies that is not helping anybody. Listen, when we teach, it's a Greek word, but he's using the Greek word that's the pair of the Hebrew word Torah. The Christian Torah is all about love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and some people straying away from these things that think they're teachers of the Torah, but in fact they're not. Myths, genealogies, speculations, Torah. Anybody? At what part of Genesis do I find odd stories that are easy to misunderstand, long genealogies that could be misinterpreted and misapplied in lots of different ways? Anybody? No, I'm just saying, he's telling you from the beginning, this is a whole set of controversies about bad interpretations of the early chapters of Genesis. Like, there's no more clear way that he could say it. Are you with me? Okay. So one, what do we know? Just track through, you guys. Track through the letter.
Everything hurts.
No, track through the letter, and what you'll find is that there's a group of men and a group of women in Ephesus who were the source of the problem. These men are trained theologians, but they're doing this with the stories of the Torah, and they've roped in a group of wealthy women who can dress more fancy than anyone else. So they've turned the gathering into a fashion show, which in the first century means a totally different thing than what it might mean in our culture, because it's a way of asserting your social status in a public setting. And so, and these women are connected to these widows. There's widows. There's a widow problem later in chapter 4. And there's some widows that are legitimate, and there are some widows that have way too much money and way too much time, and they're hogging the system. And this is all connected. In other words, the problem of teachers, the Torah, interpretations of Genesis that are inspiring both men and women to act in really inappropriate ways. So that is the context of the letter, for especially when we get to chapter 2. Now, I don't know, we could dive into chapter 2, but even just that, that's so rarely brought into the conversation, but it's so clearly at the forefront of why Paul would bring up the narratives of Genesis. And so what seems to be happening in one way or another is you have women who are in a very aggressive way usurping or asserting authority in these communities, which makes perfect sense. If a woman is of great status outside the community in Roman culture, I come into a house gathering and I'm expected to eat a meal with a slave and a Macedonian and sit with some orphans at the same table, me. You know what I mean? Like, that's the dynamic here. And so what these women want to do is grab the mic and be first. And Paul's just like, no, it's not okay. So then he goes into the Genesis narrative. This was Ben Witherington who first pointed out this little detail to me. And it was like the 3D glasses. Poof.
What book was this in?
This is, it's in his commentary. Ben Witherington has a commentary on the pastoral letters. And so he says these women need to stop teaching. What they should do is get an education and chill out. For it was Adam who was first formed. He uses the Genesis 2 verb. And then Eve. And not Adam deceived, but the woman being deceived. Okay, so in other words, the contrast is the order of creation is the opposite of the order of deception. Do you understand? So in other words, if you don't take those two halves of the contrast as mutually helping you understand why he would bring this up in the first place, what you end up with is an interpretation that's been common, namely, the man was created first, therefore he's the one in authority, and it was the woman who was deceived because women are more susceptible to deception by nature. And that has been a common interpretation. But it seems to me what he's drawing attention to, and it's fascinating in the narrative. When did the human receive the divine instruction to not eat from the tree?
Before the split.
Before the split. So the lone human was created first, then the corresponding half. But it was the corresponding half that was deceived. And you know what's interesting, in Genesis 3, in the conversation between the woman and the snake, the whole thing is about all these misquotations and misrepresentations of the original divine command. Nobody ever quotes God's words just right. And so I think Witherington's right. The whole point is that the woman would have had to receive the divine command through the other half. And it's so strange that nobody gets it right. And so Witherington, I think he's right, is saying that the woman here becomes an image of somebody who didn't receive proper instruction and then was therefore fell. And he sees that as an appropriate analogy for this crisis that's happening, which is about male teachers, right, who are really screwing up the book of Genesis, and then leading these women through their bad theology into inappropriate behavior. How you guys doing? I think it really makes sense. And then he brings up how women will be saved. What he says is, but she, singular, will be saved through the bearing, through the childbirth, with the word the in front of it. But she, Eve, will be saved through the childbirth. And they, if they continue in faith, love, sanctity, and self-restraint. He's almost certainly referring to the seed of the woman who will crush this head of the snake, that will bring salvation to solve this whole mess. I think it seems to me that's what's going on here. So I think Paul is actually tracking with this narrative in a pretty precise way. And it makes sense why he would need to go here if it was these very narratives that were the subject of controversy in this church, which he tells you that that's the case in the opening. Okay, how you guys doing?
Great.
That was awesome.
I'll stop talking. I've been talking for a long time. It's just an example. I've had this experience so many times. It's both disheartening, and humbling. That things that were so clear to me, both just intellectually, but also because of my social location. But then the moment you're exposed to a different point of view, the more I think about it, actually accounts for more of this text rather than less of it. And it's been the nature of the church's relationship to Scripture.
I think Proverbs has something to say about that.
How do you mean?
A man sounds right the first time you listen to him, but then you hear the other side, and things don't seem quite so clear.
Yeah, that's right. And this isn't about, therefore we can't know anything. This is more that learning is a journey of growth. And sometimes growth is hard because things that I thought were very clear all of a sudden are not so clear. And on a matter like gender, communities inevitably fall into patterns for how they work out their values. This is just one of those matters where I think we have, and when I say we, there have been people who've tracked with Wetherington's insight all along, but they've been a minority voice. And I think that's unfortunate.
So it's been a part of our journey, spiritual journey, that I think really made this come alive for me is, within, I think, the early church, Jesus' mother, as the king's mother, as per the cultural tradition of honoring the king's mother, had a special place and was well respected as an intercessor, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like for most of my life, in my former tradition as like a Protestant, it was just, Mary was just the teenager, she had Jesus one and out, she's out of the scene. We don't talk about her, we don't think about her until we're at the foot of the cross. And I think for me, it's been such a relief to think about Eve and Mary in the same space, and to think about, the help of God coming for humanity towards the end, right? Through a woman who was able to entirely partner with God and have this child, right, who is exactly the birth that we're talking about here. And it's been a huge, I think, form of relief for me. It's been a healing balm for me to understand the story of we call her the Theotokos, the God bearer, and our role as individuals to bear God within us, as well as the church's role to emulate Mary and be within, be obedient and to bear God and bear Jesus within ourselves, within the church body.
Yes, thank you. Let me just go back to a little textual detail that builds on what you're saying. Did you notice in this description, what vision or whatever, God builds the side into a Isha. This is very odd. It's strange. There's a perfectly good word called form that the author's already used. That's more of describes a potter, or we looked at that word. But the word build is an architectural term, isn't it? And isn't it interesting that the word side is most repeated in the Torah in one other place, in the building of the Ark of the Covenant. Right? Yep. So isn't it also interesting that the one that God's builds is the Ezer, which is the word seed, spelled differently. Yeah? And that it's precisely this Ezer that whose womb will eventuate in the birth of the snake crusher in Genesis 3:15. Are you with me? Yeah, totally. This is all over the Eastern Orthodox tradition. You got it. It's also why Zion, the temple, will go on to be depicted as Eve in the prophets. Lady Zion. It's the most common word to refer to the Jerusalem temple in the prophets. And in the book of Isaiah, whoever wrote Isaiah understands all of this, because the new Jerusalem is a new Eve. Isaiah 54 is all about Eve and all the matriarchs of Genesis giving birth to the new remnant humanity. And the temple is Eve. The temple is God's Ezer. It's the place where God meets with his people to provide for them what they cannot provide for themselves, which is life, for sure. And so the womb of Eve becomes this place of divine salvation. That's where all of this is going. And and Mary for sure plays that role. Mary and Eve's role in the Revelation is just crucial. Go read Revelation 12, and you're like, is this Mary or Eve or Jerusalem? And the answer is yes. Right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's one of those, again, places where it's right there when you look at the whole photo mosaic. And when we take one scene out of the Eden narrative and make it, right, put it into our theology, systematic theology of gender, it's just the wrong starting point. We're just not going to hear what the author wants us to hear. Yeah, there's a lot more that could be said. But at least those are some initial kind of tracks to go down. Thank you for raising that. Thank you for that insight. That was really good. Let me just maybe a closing reflection on Genesis 2:24. So the narrator pipes in and says, hey, dear reader, in case this is all just really bizarre for you, and I'm like, yes, me, this is all so strange, right? You know, this thing that happened with the one needing to become many and yet be reunited as one, this wasn't just an interesting thing that happened in the past. It's going to apply to siblings and all kinds of other unities that need to happen. But right here, it's as if the narrator says, every time that there is a marriage covenant between a man and a woman, it's a taste of potential Eden. To make one what in our world is often so separate. In particular, I think it's a pondering of a mystery here, that a human will leave one to whom he's biologically connected, mom and dad, and then be joined to one that he's not biologically connected to, but yet is the mirror. And when those others become one in unity, then we're back up to the image of God poem. And the mystery of Genesis 2:24. Are you with me? So somehow, this is a preview of where the biblical story is going. Humanity needs to become many and different from each other. But yet, for the ideal of Genesis 1 to be realized, those many have to learn how to covenant, make peace and become one through covenant. And in case you forget that, let's let every single marriage ceremony you ever go to remind you about the hope of new creation and of heaven and earth being remarried. I think that's what the narrator's telling us right here, which is why Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, will be talking through the letter about all nations becoming one, Jew and Gentile becoming one, slave and master becoming one, in part of one body, under one head, the Messiah. And when he comes to talking about wives and husbands, he culminates the whole thing in talking about, he quotes Genesis 2:24, and then he's like, listen, this just, my brain's exploding right now. And you know what I'm really talking about here? I'm talking about the deliverer, the true Ezer, Messiah, and his human family, who have become one in the power of the Spirit. That's what I'm really talking about. That's what Genesis 2:24 is ultimately about. But I forgot I was talking to husbands and wives, so let's get back to that. Husbands and wives, love each other, for goodness sakes, you know. Do you see? He totally went on a tangent. Genesis 2:24 led him into some place inside of his Bible mind. And he's like, dude, this is so intense. What I'm really talking about is the unity of God and human in the Messiah and his people. So wives and husbands, to love each other, for goodness sakes. Anyway, For a long time, Genesis 2:24 was just like, that's cool, but I don't get it. Like, why? It's interesting. And as I've sat with how it struck Paul, it seems to me that it's actually another one of these moments where this image of the one becomes many, becomes one. It's like the whole story of the Bible in one little scene right here. At least I think so. Other concluding thoughts, reflections on that point?
I have a question. Is 225 part of that narrator's interpolation? Because that's the way you've broken it out, or yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I've seen it both ways.
Yes, it's a hinge.
Okay, so you feel like that could easily be conclusion, intro
Yeah.
to the next section?
It is both. Verse 25 is both the conclusion of this scene, and it's the introduction of the next scene.
So naked and not ashamed is possible post-fail, and it's the way things were pre-fail.
Yeah, in other words, it becomes a very rich image of the intimate vulnerability of these two that are not the same. It's to be naked before one who is not yourself is vulnerable. My goodness, depending on your personality, it's vulnerable to be naked by yourself too, but that's a whole other matter, right? But to be naked in front of another, that's the ultimate vulnerability. And to paint that picture, what a more vivid picture of union and safety, harmony. You don't even have to interpret it. It tells itself. Yeah, I think that, and so the two of them, notice it's the phrase, the two of them. Were naked, but because they're one, we're cool. It's only once they have both taken to define good and evil in their own eyes. Now, I don't know if I can trust you, and that's the moment they hide their bodies from each other.
But that's my question. If it's part of this section, then it's part of the interjection post-fail. Hey, this is what's going on, and this is what's possible.
Oh, I'm sorry, I understand. Got it. No, I think with 225, we're back on a narrative comment on the man and the woman in the Eden
Pre-fail.
scene. Correct. Correct. That's correct. That's right.
But what I'm saying is, like, the way that 24 reads is,
Yes.
hey, reader, for this reason, this is what's going on today.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We break out of narrative time and come into the
Post-fail.
narrator's time. That's right.
And if we keep 25 with narrator's time,
I
and this
understand.
is what's possible, and that's why Paul can say,
I understand.
this is what, like, is possible within a marriage. I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think it's more that 224 is saying when there is a vulnerable union between two others, in this example, marriage, it's a little taste of the ideal. It's always compromise, but it is a taste of the ideal. And so imagine that in this scenario. I think that's what's going on. Yeah. Okay. The good times are unfortunately over. With the next scene, we walk into the most iconic scene, the snake and the woman and the man. But let's pause for a moment before we go down that rabbit hole.
All right. Thoughts? All right, have a good night. Yeah, it was a little confusing. And Tim was even confused, I think, a little bit by what he was saying. He was, I think, trying he was wondering if it's a hinged passage from going from 2 into 3, the fall, is it possible to still experience that intimacy after the fall? I think that's what he was asking. And yeah, it is. It's a challenge because in our sinful state, we judge all the time. I mean, we're judging people. You know, that's, and sexually speaking, there's so much of that that happens. You know, if you think about pornography and you think about just, you know, you have these paintbrushed images that are still being judged. You know what I mean. I mean, just every part you just in your imagination, and it's just sad. I mean, it's what sin does. But yes, Paula. Yeah. Yeah. And when you do, when you are able to experience that, it's such a beautiful thing. Yeah. What else? Yeah. From what I could tell, she is probably Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, and which puts a much larger emphasis on Mary than what we have traditionally done within Protestant churches, which we're a part of. And it's really, in some ways, it's kind of sad. It's kind of like the pendulum of extremes. You know, we tend to react to things. So fasting, in fact, I'm going to get into that on Sunday. The Catholic Church puts more emphasis on fasting than any Protestant church does. And there was almost like a reaction during the Reformation that we want to look different, like we're not going to do it that way. And sadly, it was almost thrown out by many Protestant churches. Now, not all of them. There are some who still do, and like we're still talking about it, and there are some other churches that do, but a lot of them are like, well, because they do that, we're not going to do it. And that's not a good reason to not do something. In Mary, there's a lot of I mean, she was an amazing woman. She carried Christ, right? I mean, her womb became the temple, if you will. Not perfect, you know, and unfortunately, with many doctrines, things are taken to an extreme, and I think within Catholicism, that is a teaching that, you know, they do have, that Mary was sinless. In order to and it's part of their doctrine of Christ being sinless. She had to be sinless. Of course, what I always ask is, well, how about her mom? You know, how far back are you going to go? And they don't address that. They just talk about Mary. You know, she, I mean, think about what she must have gone through in her life.
One thing I can say about Mary's sinless would be that God used her as an instrument and, gave her that title of sinless or free to be able to birth the Son who saves the world if you want to go that path. But I don't
Yeah.
see her being a sinless individual for anybody else. Other than that, God would have to be more instrumental in you.
Yeah. Well, and it gets back to the doctrine of original sin, that if you hold to that doctrine, then you have to create a whole system around it. But there's nothing.
The same thing as sainthood. They do a lot of sainthood.
Right.
Apostles and from then on, as up to today, we have
Pope. Right.
that's all tradition and that going into that. But honestly, that probably part of the source from the first early church. We all,
Right.
it's part of the habit.
Yeah. I think one of the things maybe that she was speaking out of when she was talking about Eve and Mary is that I think a lot of women, they've been treated poorly. They've been made to feel like second class, or we're the ones who were deceived. And you know, even when he was talking about how that traditional view that, you know, women by nature are more prone to deception, that I just curled at that when I heard that. I don't think that is true. I know many men who are easily deceived, maybe even more so than women, but that is a traditional view that you will hear talked about. And are you following me? Responsibility?
Responsibility, yeah, for the woman, and not in a negative way, more of a positive.
What I got out of the last, for this session, the last session, she's half or part of Adam, so that's,
Yes.
they're a whole, I mean, it's really the same.
Right.
And they're a whole, and they are, if one can do what another can't do in each case. And this was necessary from God to have what was the ideal, which is the Eve, or the Garden of Eden, being fulfilled as part of the whole new creation and so forth. That's the same symbolic way that you should look at it. And there's nothing about one that's more special than the other. They're equally yoked, they're equally important, but they carry out different roles.
Right.
So just because one looks like they will make their role more important, doesn't mean it's more important.
Right.
God determines that.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that man and husbands are to love their wife just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it.
Right.
One of the things that struck me was, I always heard it taught that women were saved through childbearing. And I'm like, well, what about when we can't have babies? Or,
Yeah.
or we don't want to have babies. So what he said made so much sense.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
That saved through the childbirth.
That's right.
That happened over.
It's a poor translation. It is, that we have. And it does make it sound like, well, I've got to have kids in order to be saved. No, you don't. No, and again, in the context of that, it's Genesis 2. Paul has just quoted from Genesis 2 about Adam being formed and Eve being formed, and then right after it talks about the seed of woman. And it's Christ.
We're putting too much emphasis on the humans in this, when it's about pointing toward God.
Yes. Right. Right. And even the picture of marriage. Even the picture of marriage is ultimately about Christ and the church. Isn't that something? And I love what he said there about how every wedding we go to should be a reminder to us of just how much Jesus loves us and how he's taken the many and made them one. And it's a mystery. It really is a mystery. It doesn't happen by itself. It's a beautiful gift of the Spirit. Only by the Spirit can we enjoy that kind of peace. Yeah. What else?
I've never thought about that she wasn't there when the instructions were given. It never occurred to me that it was only,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. And he failed in telling her the whole story. And yeah. And doubly when he went ahead and took of it. And didn't stop her. It just kind of like, oh, you liked it? Well, try it too.
There's leadership for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And the same in Timothy. There are false teachers who have infiltrated the church, and they are teaching these myths and whatever. And Paul is saying, look, you've got to correct this. You have a responsibility to teach truth. So.
We can't forget that the position that Jesus comes into is not the ideal church, the way it was supposed to be designed through the law. It's all confusing. He's even telling them, you don't even know half of what you're talking about. You're
Right.
leading away in dangerous areas. And so Paul's actually following through Jesus' steps and describing that in that scenario as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes on, there in 1 Timothy 2:11, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over man. She must be quiet. In 1 Corinthians 11, I'm pretty sure it's there that Paul talks about when there was confusion in the church, disorder, and it was some wives that were there because Paul says, be quiet and ask your husbands at home. So he's addressing a particular situation where where there was this exercise of usurpation of authority, or whatever that is, that was wrong, and it was causing a lot of confusion. And again, it could have been some wealthy women, who just didn't care, or just wanted to be brass, if you will. And Paul says, no, stop. I think where we've got to be careful and where we've not been very good at teaching this ourselves, we've just made some assumptions and we've just carried it over for all time. When we're talking about a couple of situations in Corinth and in Ephesus, that there's some unruly women, and that's what Paul's talking about. I don't know about you all, but I'm thankful that you women feel free to share in here and talk. A number of you have already, but there are some places you cannot do that. I mean, you will be told you're usurping my authority. No, you're not. And we don't even know. We've confused that, what that means. And again, I'm not pushing an agenda here. I just want to be biblical. And I'm afraid that out of fear and out of tradition, we have held back, I believe, being able to hear from godly women who have something to offer. They're not usurping the elders' authority. They're under the oversight of the elders. Can there be men who can usurp their authority? Just as much as a woman could usurp authority. That's not right either. So I think we...
That's what I'm thinking of two being have to get one.
Yes,
Again, they're operating, one has operating out of the one.
exactly.
And I think that's why it's alluded to on who should be, encouraged to be in certain roles. There's an indication of two being one. It's part of that
Right.
criteria.
Yep.
So it represents that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yes. Thank you. Tommy, you got anything you want to chime in on?
I guess the only thing I would say is, I said it a couple weeks ago, the world is desperately in need to see the biblical picture, the biblical narrative in action, demonstrated in the world, what God has in mind for gender and what God has in mind for these relationships between men and women. And this is so good. Man, I'm so thankful to be a part of a church that we can watch something like this.
Yeah.
And I know not everybody wants to watch this. That, it's different for me. I don't want to see that, and I want to help and love them too, as well. Man, but man, that we can hear this, and and that we can say, man, that's really messing with me a little bit. Yeah. And at the end of the day, what matters is we're supposed to live out the new life of heaven on earth.
That's right.
And the new life of heaven was demonstrated in Genesis 1 and 2.
That's right.
This is what the life of heaven for humanity is all about.
Yeah.
This is what it is.
It's about to get ugly.
Yeah. And then it got to.
Real quick, we're going to see in chapter 3.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, that was actually good. I was just going to add to that. The way I look at it is it's like a compass in your hand. You're not sure which way you're going without the compass.
Yeah.
But now, if you know which way north is pointed, you know which way to go. And to me, what the Bible tells us is the greatest of these is love. And if we're pointed north is love, then we're pointed going in the right direction. If we're steering off because we're more comfortable with this instead of that, and we're not considering the love involved, then we've got to readjust. Does that make sense?
It does. Makes sense.
Yeah.
And was it Abraham Lincoln that said, what's the point of having a compass? No. He says, what's the point of knowing north if you don't know where all the, in between you and your destination, there's swamps and, things that you might get lost in, so you got to pay attention to that. But that's what you got to do first.
You go back to the compass.
Yeah, exactly. Man, I wish you guys could have heard what Mark and I heard Monday. The guy was talking about this, about that, and an author that, wow, he really challenged me.
Yeah, sure did. Well, and one of the things he was pointing out is why Jesus came. Jesus came to show us true north and how to get there, and taking us back to Genesis 1 and 2 and how he treated people and how he loved people. And the Bible is showing us what happened, when it got off track, but also the hope we have and why Jesus came, and his prayer of thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that we're a part of. That's a part of our purpose here. We're to emulate that and show that. And we're a work in progress. We're not there, and we'll never get there completely because of our fallenness, but it's a goal, right? And we're moving, and hopefully the next generation that comes behind us, we have helped them just get a little bit closer to it until that day when he returns. And that day's coming. Some would say sooner than later. Of course, every generation said it, right? Because they long for it, and they yeah. All right, well, thank you all. This is good. Anybody else before we close? Any last thought? All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for our time together tonight. God, we're being stretched. We can feel your spirit here and working in our lives, in our hearts, in our minds. Thank you for these truths that we're able to dive into and to understand your word better, to understand the background, the culture, why these things were written, the words that were used, because we want to know better, Lord. We want to understand your will more completely and be able to apply that to our cultural context. So thank you. Bless us as we go from here. God, keep us strong and united. Thank you for the beautiful picture of Christ in the church, and help us to keep that in our minds and our hearts. In Jesus we pray. Amen.